So, it comes now a great pleasure to introduce Heidi Chow, who is the Executive Director of Debt Justice, formerly called the Jubilee Debt Campaign, which gives you some idea how long it's been going on. Debt Justice is a UK-based campaigning organisation working to end unjust debt and the poverty and inequality it perpetuates. Heidi is an experienced and well-respected economic justice campaigner with a long track record spanning 2 decades of winning public campaigns on key global economic justice issues. But we've asked her to come and talk to us not about international debt, which is a big part of her job, but about the alarming increase in UK household debt. Heidi.
Hello, and thank you so much for inviting me up to Shropshire to speak today, to the Shropshire Humanists meeting. It's really lovely to see you all. I've never been to this part of the world before. I was just telling Simon on the way up, so I'm really sorry. So thank you for this invitation. I get to see your lovely town. As Simon says, my name is Heidi. I'm the Executive Director at Debt Justice, and we're a campaigning organisation. We campaign on unjust debt, both in terms of the build-up of debt in households across the UK, as well as challenging the build-up of debt with global south governments across the world. We've been around for about 30 years, so as Simon says, you may have heard of us from our previous name, Jubilee Debt Campaign. So we were called that for most of our history, and we only changed our name last year because we wanted to better reflect what we do and who we are. So.
I just want to say thank you as well, Simon, for putting on this event, for hosting a meeting on this very important topic. I first met Simon back in September when he came to the Debt Justice National Activist Gathering with his brother John. John is a long-standing activist at Debt Justice. He's been with us for almost 30 years as well himself, and I would put a lot of the credit of the work that the organisation has done in the hands of John, who's done amazing work over the last 3 decades. So I kind of feel like Simon is part of our extended Debt Justice family. So I'm going to be talking today about the UK household debt crisis, and it's probably not a surprise to anyone that there are millions of households across the UK right now really struggling with debt. So at the moment we have 12.8 million adults who are in heavy debt. So heavy debt is defined as being behind on repayments or finding repayments a very big financial burden. We see, and that figure has gone up 66% since 2017. So a huge increase in the number of people who are experiencing heavy debt. We have credit card borrowing at record levels at the moment. And so that's a really worrying sign that people are turning to expensive credit just to pay for their basic needs. And then we've also have energy debt, which has been built up. So £2.6 billion worth of energy debt. Again, that is at record levels. And again, no surprise, because energy bills have shot up in the last couple of years. And even with government support through the energy support scheme and through the energy price cap, actually energy bills have been really expensive over the last few years. And even though inflation figures are coming down, as we saw yesterday, even though energy prices are coming down in the global market, actually energy bills still remain really high, and they're almost double what they were 12 months ago. So the problem hasn't gone away. And of that £2.6 billion worth of energy debt that's been built up in households, about £1 billion of that is owed by people who are on prepaid meters. And prepaid meters, people who are on prepay accounts are particularly vulnerable to disconnection this winter, because prepay accounts, you need to top up the money first before you can get any energy. And so there's a real threat for people on prepayment meters this winter struggling with energy debt in order to be able to keep their homes warm this winter. So household debt isn't a new problem. It's actually been building up over over a decade or so, ever since the global financial crisis of 2008. And that's because we've had a very long period of stagnating wages, stagnating income. And that's been exacerbated as well by years of austerity, which has essentially eroded the social safety net. So essentially, people haven't had enough income to live off. And so debt's been used as a way to plug the gap in household budgets. And then what we've seen in the last few years with the pandemic and then with the war in Ukraine, pushing up food and fuel prices, we've got a period of high inflation, high energy bills. All of that has created a perfect storm of stagnating incomes and higher costs. And you probably don't need to be a big genius to know that that creates a real sense of pressure for so many households who are struggling, and therefore turning to debt as a way to plug that gap. I just want to give a quote from, this is Anthony Riley, somebody who filled in one of our surveys recently. I have for the first time in many years accumulated debt, which is down to the rising costs of food, fuel, energy and other consumables. I'm really worried what the next 12 months will bring, as I'm already struggling to make ends meet. And so as you can hear from that quote, actually, being in debt is not just a financial issue. It is, of course, but it also has serious long-term social consequences, not least on things like the pressure that it creates on relationships and leading to relationship breakdown, but also the pressures on health, especially on mental health and stress. Here's another quote. I myself am in debt, and since a terrible accident I had last year, I've been classed as disabled, and I've no way of paying any debt back. And the debt companies constantly hound you to the point where I'm scared to open mail or open the door or even to go out at all. And that's that gives you an idea of the sense of pressure that people feel, the sense of stress and fear and anxiety when they're in a situation of debt. And so we see that 50% of people in debt actually have a mental health problem. And people in debt often describe the experience as feeling like they're drowning. So it's no surprise that actually we see the statistics are so high that 400,000 people who are in debt in England say that they consider taking their own lives because of the situation that debt has placed them under. And unsustainable debt also affects employability. It affects people's ability to concentrate at work, their productivity. And within a household, it can also create a lot of pressure for the well-being of children, children who grow up in households that are experiencing problem debt, and also can lead to unemployment and homelessness. And the estimated cost of dealing with all of these social consequences of problem debt in our society has been estimated to around £10 billion a year. And that is the cost that is incurred by local and national government to deal with the consequences and the issues that result in terms of employment, housing and mental health. And then the other social impacts is that the debt it has a turbocharging effect on existing inequalities. So it magnifies, amplifies, exacerbates existing inequalities in our society. And so people who are renters, women, people with disabilities, people of colour, they are disproportionately affected by problem debt. And there's also a big perception issue about debt as well. Debt is largely seen as an individual problem, and so often people think about people in debt and they think, oh, it's somebody who's mismanaged their finances. And then this stereotype is often reinforced by the fact that people who are in debt often don't talk about it because of that social stigma, because of the sense of moral, personal failing that they're in debt. And so often society sees people as being in debt as not just that they've done a bad thing, so much as they're a bad person. And so there's this weight of social stigma that is attached to this whole issue. And so this silencing of people who are in debt actually has really significant ramifications in terms of their voices being absent from the political debate, from public debate, or when people talk about debt, their voices are often not in the room. And the other problem with individualisation is the over-reliance on individual solutions. And that's why the government often, when they think about debt, their only solution to the issue is individual advice. So they put money into providing debt advice services, debt advice agencies into local communities, which actually even that funding is under threat. And the debt advice agencies have been fighting against government cuts around debt advice. But So there's a lot of emphasis on individual solutions, reinforcing that narrative around an individualization of the problem. And what there's been very little attention to is actually attention on the systemic failings of an economy that has forced people into this position, and the systemic failings of an economy that hasn't worked for people, that doesn't give people the means to be able to provide the basics of their daily needs. And then dealing with this as an individual problem also keeps people who are in debt atomized and isolated on one hand, and on the other hand distracts away from the economic decisions that has created the situation that we have today. So essentially it's a systemic problem. The household debt crisis that we're seeing isn't a moral failing of individuals, nor is it something that's just happened. But it's a product of deliberate policies that we've seen for over many years that's created this economy that is characterized by low wages, insecure work, a weak social safety net, like I said, eroded by over a decade of austerity. And so we end up with this situation of chronic stagnating incomes, people just simply not having enough to live on. And so it's no surprise that when people have been using debt to plug the gap in their household budgets, that when something happens that is unexpected, or when there's an external shock, like a pandemic, or like high energy bills, or if people suddenly find themselves losing a job, or have a diagnosis, or going into an accident, any one of these unforeseen circumstances or external shocks, as economists like to call them, any of one of these things can therefore plunge people into a crisis situation. Astra Taylor is a prominent debt activist in the US, and this is how she puts it. Most people are not in debt because they live beyond their means. They are in debt because they have been denied the means to live. And so once people start taking on debt, actually it can be really hard to escape it. It can be really hard to get out of debt because of the way the debt system works and because of the lack of debt solutions available to people once they get into debt. And so, for example, the consumer credit markets are very regressive. So the poorer you are, the higher the charges you pay, the higher the interest rates you pay. And then when you get into debt, the reasons why you couldn't afford to pay your bills in the first place haven't disappeared. And so it's even harder to make those repayments. And it's very easy to end up getting into what we call a debt trap, where actually you end up refinancing your debt with even more debt. And it becomes an endless spiral of increasing indebtedness. And so debt needs to be seen as a systemic problem, because when we do that, we can then deploy systemic solutions. So as you probably, as I've alluded to, actually the problem of debt is a problem of a broken economy. It's a problem of an economy that doesn't work for ordinary people. And so we do need to see transformative changes. When people say, what do we do about this? We need transformative changes in our economy. So we need to see a welfare system that actually works. We need to see a welfare system that is improved and strengthened, that actually enables people who are going through hard times to actually live a life of dignity and have the basic provisions that they need to live that dignified life. We need to see incomes boosted and better jobs with better job security. So through strengthening unions, union rights, having better collective bargaining. And we also need to guarantee decent incomes as well. And then we also need to tackle the injustices that are built into the debt system as well. Because like I said, once you get in debt, the debt system keeps you trapped there. And there are no release valves. There's no way out apart from experiencing poverty and hardship for years and years and years, caught in that debt trap. And so that's one of the things that we are campaigning for. We're campaigning for the government to write off energy debt. I mentioned the £2.6 billion worth of energy debt that's building up in households across the country. And that debt isn't going anywhere because the bills continue to remain high. And incomes are remaining stagnant, and so there is really no way that we can foresee this energy debt being paid off. So we're campaigning with a wide coalition of organisations, including organisations like Fuel Poverty Action, Step Change, Money Advice Trust, Citizens, all the major sort of debt advisors and anti-poverty campaigners, to call on the government to set up what we're calling a help to repay scheme, targeted support for people who are struggling with energy debt, to have that energy debt actually written off and enable people to have a fresh start. Of the £2.6 billion worth of energy debt that's been built up in this country, I mentioned that £1 billion of that is owed by people on prepay accounts. And these people are the ones that are specifically vulnerable this winter because they are at higher risk of disconnection and therefore at risk of living in dark, damp and cold conditions. And no person in this country should ever have to live in those sorts of conditions. So that's why calling for this help to repay scheme, this access to a debt relief scheme essentially, would alleviate a lot of the pressure, anxiety that a lot of households are feeling, as well as prevent people from sliding into that awful place of having to live in dark and damp, cold homes. But also prevent other credit users who pay by direct debit from preventing them from having to be moved on to prepay accounts as well. There's a question that always gets asked to us whenever we talk about cancelling debt, because a lot of the work my organisation does is around campaigning for debt cancellation, whether that's the cancellation of debts of governments in the global south, or whether it's about cancelling debts here in the UK context, especially on the work that we're doing right now around energy debt. And I guess it's a very common question because deeply ingrained in our society, in lots of people's consciousness, but also lots of societies around the world actually, is this idea that you always pay what you owe. And so if I, for example, came here this evening and told you that I left my wallet at home and needed to borrow £10 from you, you'd probably lend me the £10 and you'd probably rightly expect me to pay it back because it's a transaction between two equal people who roughly have equal sense of power in that relationship. But actually, when it comes to the sheer scale of household debt in this country, actually this is not a transaction between two equal parties. It's normally a transaction between somebody who's incredibly vulnerable, who has been left without enough to live a decent life by a system that has been where the rules are rigged against them. And it's about an economy that not working for people, and people having been forced into a situation where, in order to put food on the table or to put the lights on, they've had to borrow in the first place. And so a lot of times, because this debt has been built up because of the cost of living crisis, because of high inflation and high energy prices, actually, essentially, this debt is unpayable. And you can either continue to force people to pay up, and that would create a debt trap, a spiraling debt trap and increased indebtedness, or you can provide people with a release valve and enact an act of redistribution to enable them to have that fresh start again. And actually, debt cancellation isn't actually such a radical idea because it happens every day in our economy. So when corporations, big multinational corporations, when they get in trouble and they can't pay their debts, they have legislation and they have processes in place that enable them to restructure their debts and have their debts cancelled. And no one makes a fuss and says, oh, corporations weren't responsible, they shouldn't have their debts cancelled. So there's a whole legislation and a whole legal process in place to enable corporations to have their debts cancelled. And even consumer debt, did you know that consumer debt that's unpayable actually gets sold off in the secondary debt markets every day? It gets written off every day, millions and millions of pounds of it gets written off. But it doesn't benefit the people who are in debt, it benefits the secondary debt collectors. So there's a secondary debt collection market where secondary debt collectors buy up unpayable debt, and then they go and try and recoup that debt from the person who owes it, because there's a level of profit to be made from it. So this idea of debt cancellation actually isn't so radical. It happens every day in our economy. It's just that it never happens for people who actually need it. So these are the sorts of ideas that we believe will help address some of the build-up of debts that are taking place in our economies, in our communities today. But Ultimately, debt is about power. I talked a little bit about it already. The power of a very powerful creditor, somebody who holds a lot of power and influence over a debtor who's normally, by definition, is in a much more vulnerable position. And actually, I've talked about the way that debt multiplies existing inequalities. So normally the debtor is also somebody who's also facing other disadvantages potentially, whether it's disabilities or whether it's the fact they're already renting or that they're in a precarious situation. So one of the people who attended one of our events earlier this year, who's a person in debt, who's joining one of our activist groups, described it this way, that debt is a way of funneling money from the poor to the rich. So in order to address that disparity, some of the work that my organisation does is, in addition to running these national campaigns for things like to write off energy debt, we're also working with people in debt to create local campaigning groups, to using community organising to build power, collective power of people in debt to actually lead their own campaigns on the issues, on the debt issues that affect them, to make a difference in their lives. And so this project, we're calling these Together Against Debt groups, and we have 4 groups around the UK that are made up of people in debt who are leading campaigns and creating the change in the debt system in their local community. And I just want to share some of the success that they've had this year. It's been really exciting seeing people come together and breaking that sense of isolation, that atomization, that shame, and instead of being experiencing that mental health and stress on their own, actually they've come together with other people with lived experience of debt to actually create real change. So our Glasgow group this year managed to win a campaign to force the Glasgow City Council to cancel all school meal debt across the whole city of Glasgow. So really exciting stuff, £300,000 of school meal debt owed by families that are struggling, completely wiped off. And this has made a real difference in terms of children who are experiencing food poverty across the city of Glasgow. And it's also helped to fuel a national campaign in Scotland to go one step further and actually fight for free school meals across the whole of Scotland as well. And then in Manchester, our Manchester group has won their campaign to force Manchester City Council to introduce a whole new set of measures to prevent the use of bailiffs to collect council tax debt. So normally with council tax, if you miss one payment, you're liable for the whole year's worth of council tax. And if you miss that, then normally it's the bailiffs come around quite soon after that. And the use of bailiffs is extremely outdated, cruel, but also highly ineffective. Loads of studies have shown that actually bailiffs don't recover council tax debt, and not surprisingly, because people who struggle to pay council tax debt have struggled for a reason. So the campaign there has managed to win a whole set of measures, which include things like breathing spaces and grants to households that are struggling with council tax debt. And then the campaign's now been pushed one step further, and they are now, and the Manchester City Council are now undertaking a review to consider banning bailiffs completely across the whole city of Manchester. So that's another really exciting win, because it would have a real material difference for the lives of people who are experiencing difficulty right now in paying their council tax, but potentially, because Manchester is one of the biggest cities in this country, could potentially have a knock-on effect on influencing other councils to take similar steps as well. But I wanted to share these things with you because I feel like I talked a lot about miserable things and a lot of hardship and a lot of things that are wrong with this system. I wanted to share with you some glimmers of hope, as it were, glimmers of where people come together and break out of their isolation and come together in collective action, that actually they can make a real difference. So I'm just going to finish off by summarising a few things that you could do if you want to support our campaign and some of our work. So the first thing is that we have an energy debt petition as part of our campaign to the government, and it would be great if you could sign our petition this evening. There's a paper version on the clipboard on that table over there, and Simon, it'd be great if you could put some pens out for us. And there's also versions of the same thing at the back of our booklet. So we've got some booklets there, and if you want to take away the booklet, you're most welcome to, and then just tear off the back page where you can sign the petition as well. So two ways you can sign the petition this evening. So that'd be really great, because we're trying to build up the number of support for this campaign, and we are working with Warm This Winter Coalition and 38 Degrees to do a big hand-in the first week of December. So if you can sign tonight, then that'd be brilliant, because it means we can take all those signatures and have a really nice big number to take to Downing Street in a few weeks' time. The second thing is, so I mentioned these Together Against Debt groups, which are based in local communities across the UK, and we're still a very small organisation, so we can't support loads and loads of groups across the UK, but we are trying to create a national network of people with experience of debt, so that we will network up the existing groups, but we also want to invite other people to join, other people who've got experience of debt that want to be part of the activism and the campaigning to create a national campaign on some of these issues. So if you are somebody who's either in debt now, or you've got experience of being in problem debt, or you know somebody who's in that situation and wants to do some activism and wants to be involved in a campaign, then please speak to me afterwards, and I'd love to get your details and connect you in with our national network of Together Against Debt campaigns. And then thirdly, I want to encourage you also to take action with us, take action in solidarity with people who are experiencing debt right now. So at the moment, we're working on something called the People's Manifesto Against Debt. So for the last 4 months, we've been holding a series of face-to-face meetings, online meetings, consultations, discussion groups, surveys, various forms, various different platforms to try and bring together the views and experiences and stories and priorities of people who are in debt, because we want to take all of those experiences and priorities and turn that into a set of political demands that we want to package up as a manifesto that we want to use in the run-up to the general election next year. So it's an opportunity for us to really push the voices of people who've got experience of debt, push their voices into the foreground. As I said, often people don't like to talk about debt issues, they don't like to talk about their experiences, but we want to change that, because we want their voices to shape the debates, and we want their demands to be the demands that we campaign behind. So in the new year, we're just finishing off that process now. In the new year, we're going to launch that manifesto, and we want to invite as many people as possible to sign up to that manifesto, whether that's individuals to sign up to it, or getting our local councillors, MPs, parliamentary candidates to sign up to it, high-profile people to sign up to it, just lots of people to sign up to this manifesto on debt, to raise this issue in solidarity with people who are in debt, who have developed this manifesto. So again, if you are interested in helping us in any way with that sort of wider campaign in the new year around a manifesto on debt, the best thing to do probably is to sign the petition this evening and just tick the box to say you'd like email updates, and then we'll keep you updated on the actions and updates that you can take as part of this campaign. So anyway, I really hope that's given you a really good overview of the issues and some of the things that we can do practically in response to the issue. And I'm really happy to take any questions.
Leslie, thank you very much indeed. What we usually do now is have 5 minutes, literally 5 minutes, to stretch your legs, grab a coffee if you want, look at some of the paperwork there, and then we'll have questions. All right. You know, it's always daunting when you're told 1 million people this, but actually those stories we heard are of individual people are heartbreaking. These are people who, you know, they work hard, but circumstances have meant they've had to borrow, and then suddenly they're in a downward spiral, and there are millions of them. So this is a real problem. Now, I know we've got people here from the CAB and other organisations that are sort of involved in these sort of things, so, and Samaritans. So please, let's have some questions for Heidi.
Thank you, Heidi. How do you differentiate between someone who's in debt by drinking gin and smoking cigarettes and those who have been ill? How do you differentiate? Or do you?
So if we're talking about, for example, so some of the things that we're advocating for as an organisation is, you know, the writing off of energy debt. Actually, we also have a broader demand, but it's something that we're not actively working on right now, which is actually a broader debt reset for households on consumer debt more generally. And actually, some of the thinking that we've done behind this is that we'd probably use the debt advice system to identify people who require that level of debt reset. And actually, I think it's not up to us to pass judgment as well on people's situation and whether they and to kind of, you know, measure them on a scale of deserving or undeserving, you know, poor. It's very kind of, it has that kind of, I guess, that element of sort of Victorian kind of angle on that. So I don't think it's up to us to judge people's circumstances. And if people have got in debt because of, you know, for example, let's say drinking or drug abuse or whatever, actually, however they got into that situation, nevertheless the situation is there and they are experiencing hardship and difficulty. And I think our job in that scenario is, rather than to judge their circumstances or the reasons why they got into the circumstances they're in, is really to think about how do we alleviate poverty and hardship for that person. Because ultimately, as Simon says, ultimately they are a person who has the right to live with a level of dignity and well-being.
Can I ask a question? Glasgow and Manchester, I think, are Labour councils, and that may be one of the reasons you had successes. Do you think if we have a change of government, you may find it easier to promote your ideas?
Yes and no. I think if the change of government would change the whole political landscape of the UK completely. But at the same time, I also feel like the current Labour frontbench is very, very cautious, very unambitious. And actually, when we talked to Labour MPs, went to Labour Party conference, for example, a lot of them saw debt just as a symptom of the cost of living crisis, rather than seeing debt as an issue that needs to be dealt with and have a set of solutions, in particular to get people out of debt once they get into debt. So that's why I sort of say yes and no. Like, I feel like the political landscape will change, but I don't see I don't see the front bench committing to the level of ambition that we would be after, because we would want, ideally we'd want a Labour government to actually recognise that debt is a consequence of the cost of living crisis, and we do need to tackle the underlying cost of living crisis, and also, like I said, the underlying structures of our economy more broadly. But at the same time, we also need a set of solutions that enable people to get out of that debt trap, which are very specifically targeted to people in that space, because you could transform the whole economy, but you'd still have people trapped in that sense of that debt spiral, that debt trap that I talked about, and that's why we do need specific policies addressing that debt as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. That's a good question. Yeah. The gentleman in the black top, and then maybe the lady next, and then the lady afterwards. Yeah. Do you want to go first? Yeah. Sorry.
Oh, just me. I was just thinking, do you have any other countries in mind who are managing it better than we are?
Oh, it's a good question.
Or is it some sort of function of our Americanisation of our economy?
Yeah, I was going to say I can think of countries worse than us as well. Like, I was thinking about the US, where actually the debt situation in the US is a lot more severe than us because of the financialisation of their whole economy and because of the absolute absence of any kind of public services or the absence of free education, free healthcare and so on. So actually, the Astra Taylor, who I quoted earlier, she's an American activist, and they are working on the cancellation of college debt, because universities in America, people rack up almost $500,000 when they come out of university, and also incarceration debt. So this is where people who are incarcerated, who remember in America are predominantly black men, they are charged for their own incarceration, and they get into debt for being, and especially when they've been wrongfully incarcerated as well. But nevertheless, so those are the kinds of issues that they're working on in the US. But I guess that situation's worse. I don't really know of any examples where. There is one example of Croatia where they introduced a debt relief scheme similar to the ones that we've been talking about. But there aren't many other examples in the world of governments actually tackling the debt problem in and of itself. And just to sort of clarify that the work that we do internationally on Global South debt is actually slightly different. So in the UK, we work on sort of personal household debt. On the Global South, we work with people in global south countries looking at their government debt. And their government debt is slightly different from our government debt because in global south countries, they have had to borrow from externally, so borrow from other governments, borrow from IMF, World Bank, and borrow from banks and hedge funds. And so that creates a different set of kind of problems in terms of how the rules of the global economy control global south development, the development of global south countries in a way that is to the benefit of rich countries and not to poorer countries. So that is a slightly different issue when we do on our international work. The lady with her hands stretched up high.
Do you not think, does nobody do anything about the situation where everything was privatised? To my mind, utilities are an essential part of life, electric, water, gas, whatever. We all need them. And at the moment, the prices are high, not because of all these external things, because they're trying to please fat cat shareholders, and they won't invest in the water or sewage or all these things because they want to make vast profits. If it was nationalised, as it used to be, you knew where you were and the prices could be kept down by government. Surely that's common sense.
Yeah, completely.
Everything's gone to pot since they've done that.
I mean, I completely agree with you. I've worked on what we would call democratic public ownership. I used to work on that on the pharmaceuticals industry, on the production of drugs. That actually we should have democratic public ownership, and I think we should have democratic public ownership of all of our key, the key social, exactly, all the key things that you need for life. You know, whether that's like I said, electricity, water, the transport. I completely agree with you in terms of, so like when we talk about, so for example, when we talk about energy debt, the problem about energy prices is a big problem. We're only dealing with the bit on, the bit that concerns debt. But actually, when people ask us and they'll say, oh, but actually, if you deal with the energy debt, you've still got the whole system in place. And I agree, the whole system is still in place, and that's why we work alongside other movements and other organisations that do campaign on things like public ownership, but also fighting for something called Energy for All, which is this idea of a social tariff that actually everybody should have a minimum amount of energy for free. Every household, because it should be a human right to have energy, to have to be able to keep your lights on and a basic standard of warmth, and then that would be subsidised by excessive energy users. But we also need to move away from the dependence on the international market for fossil fuels and invest more in renewables in this country, not least for the sake of energy security, but also because of climate crisis. And we also need a mass home insulation program in this country to prevent to also reduce the demand for energy, as well as thinking about the supply side of energy. But I would say that would be the holistic kind of, so that you'd have that would be a holistic solution. You'd have your public ownership, you'd have these insulation schemes, moving over renewables, and you'd deal with the energy debt. And then we take it all down, afterwards. This gentleman at the back.
Well, you mentioned about some people had, or the ideal would be to have everyone having a certain amount of energy for free. But why don't we go even further, as I think one or two countries are thinking, and that is having a minimum salary for everyone, whether they're working or not. And that would actually allow people to be out of debt, and also save an enormous amount from the government in other ways. So have you thought about that?
Yeah, we don't personally. Our organisation doesn't work on that, but I know the organisation that does work on that, and we do talk to them a lot, and they do. There's a number of different organisations. Some are working on what's called a universal basic income. Some people. There's also some people working on another campaign which is called universal basic public services. But I think common to all of these different ideas and schemes is this idea that everybody needs a basic level of income to be able to survive and to be able to meet their needs. And actually, and if we had that, actually, we could do away with benefits. We could do away with we could potentially eliminate debt as well. Though there might be debt in other forms. For example, people might used to borrow for mortgages or whatever. But certainly, that idea I think is. Definitely something that we would definitely think about, and we've been talking to other organisations and other campaigning groups that are working on this to sort of see how this campaign develops, because I think there's still Ironically, still, I don't think it's a very radical idea. I think it's actually a very common sense idea, but there's a lot of people in the mainstream that would find it a very radical idea. This person here, and then that person at the back.
Most of us here will know about the idea of the social contract, and I think most of us will feel that the social contract in this country has been comprehensively reneged upon by politicians in general and the government in particular. Is there any way of holding them to account through the legal system?
Yes and no. Yes, there is some way. So I've been talking to an organisation called Just Fair. So they basically work on what's called economic, social and cultural rights. So these are the rights that have been enshrined in international law and at the UN, which basically guarantees, says that all the signatories to the economic, social and cultural rights need to implement policies to enable people to have that basic standard of living. And actually that organisation looks at legal routes as one of the campaign tactics to try and hold the UK government to account, because the UK government has actually signed up to that set of rights. But we've seen it violated again and again and again, not least through through the 2010s and through years and years of austerity. And then not least now with the cost of living crisis. So yeah, there are other organisations that are set up to specifically identify opportunities to hold the government to account on those sorts of things, and from a rights-based angle. Yeah. The person at the back.
Where can I find examples of how people get into debt? The stories that they must tell you, and there must be a certain number that have similarities, so that I can be more sympathetic, really. Because I think it needs to be explained at that sort of level. I may be wrong. I mean, I think of the films by, I think it's Ken Roach, sort of the social films.
Yes.
And I think, funny enough, I wouldn't mind hearing someone anonymously telling me, how they got to the position they're in. Because I think that would build my understanding of what I can do about it.
Yes, yeah. It's a good question. I think there are organisations such as Citizens and Debt Change, some of the big debt agencies. They do a lot of work about sharing the stories of people in debt, because they work with them on a very day-to-day basis, and they get permission to share those stories, and they will feature those stories on their websites and on the reports that they produce. We do a little bit of it. We don't do loads because our work mainly is around campaigning and activism, but we are trying to find different ways of bringing their stories to the fore, because, like I said, I was just saying to someone in the break time that this is often called a silent crisis, because people don't know it's happening, even though when you tell them, actually, it's like, of course it's happening, of course people are struggling, and of course if you're struggling, there's nowhere to turn. Debt is normally the answer you need to look towards. So, so I would say that organisations like Citizens, JRF, who are the big anti-poverty debt agencies.
And the media can come in here and tell us the stories.
Yeah, they have been. So we worked, for example, we worked with ITV earlier this year, and one of our campaigners actually featured in an ITV story on debt. So there are some of the media outlets will cover some of this, but unfortunately I can't direct you to one place to find it all. I think that's the issue. But
I was trying. But if I don't understand the personal level, because I am not in debt.
Yeah, no.
And I haven't had that experience. So
no, that's fine. And I would encourage you to sign up to maybe some of our work that we're doing next year on a manifesto against debt, because we are bringing in some of those stories into that manifesto.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that there's been the time dramas that have been on, and when you saw the recent one about a women's prison by Jimmy McGovern and a woman who had been in prison herself. And it was, they're just so good, they're a hard watch. There was only 3 episodes. But one of the women was in prison, and these are based on factual stories, that all she'd done is fiddle the electricity because, she couldn't keep her kids warm. She was on her own, 3 kids, but she had a flat, rented flat, she had a job. They threw her into prison. So her mum took the kids, but then she'd been brought up by an alcoholic mum. Mum's still alcoholic. So then the kids were taken into care. She did her sentence, went back out, and she couldn't get her kids back, so she had a flat and a home for them again. So she worked behind a bar, but was caught stealing money to try and get a deposit for a flat, back in prison again. You know, and it was so well done, because she went in there with a home, you know, 3 kids, a job, surviving. All she'd done was that minor misdemeanor, really. And then her whole life was absolutely in bits. Couldn't get her kids back. It's very worth. Has anybody not seen it? Nobody watched these things. Brilliant, yeah. And they did what they did. He wrote one on a men's prison as well with Sean Bean and the chap's name as well. And that was equally, you know, poignant, because you know I think people avoid watching these. I think they do. If you want to know how the other half lives, watch those sort of dramas, because they're not
Filmed in
exaggerated.
Shrewsbury as well.
Yeah.
Filmed in Shrewsbury jail.
Yeah.
Sean Bean one.
Yeah, yeah, that's right, the one with Sean, yeah.
I had this person in green here.
Just quickly, I'm from Citizens of Shropshire, so I just thought I'd give like a little background for Shropshire as well.
Yeah, that'd be good.
So, so Citizens of Shropshire, this year we looked in July, and we'd surpassed the amount of debt we were dealing with from the previous year. So the previous year was 1.2 million, and we'd already surpassed that in 6 months of this year. Last year, we saw lots of non-priority debts. That's things like credit cards, things that basically, if you don't pay them, nothing's taken from you. Whereas this year, the priority debt is much higher, so that's energy, housing, things that I think can be taken off you. And that had surpassed non-priority, where all the previous years we've been dealing with non-priority. In Shropshire, we have 360, I think, people applied for a breathing space. So that's to get your creditors to stop contacting you, to freeze the interest rates. It doesn't mean your debts are cancelled, it just means that you're given time to find some advice, which is higher than the national average. And we're top 10 in the country for fuel debt because of the reliance on solid fuels in parts of the county. And also what we're seeing at Citizens Advice is a rise in negative budgets. So that's where no matter what advice we give, someone cannot meet their minimum needs. So that's literally just the clothes on their back, the fuel to heat their home, and food. And we can't find any benefits to boost that. They're already claiming whatever they can, or they're in work and ineligible for benefits, or they're doing both. We're seeing that rise, so these people are then using credit to get food, to buy clothes, to heat their homes, and they then cannot service that debt, so it's just growing. So we're expecting next year the debt to be even higher. And in Shropshire as well, so I specialise in the food banks, so I work with the food banks. Shrewsbury Food Bank got given this year 70,000 kilograms of food. They gave out 140,000 kilograms of food. They bought in an extra 70,000 kilograms. They're spending £1,000 a week. So is Bridgenorth, so is Oswestry. Oswestry is on track to spend £30,000 this year on additional food, as is Church Stretton. It's all over the county. And lots of them have things in there, you know, try and get debt advice to people, but it's patchy all over the county because of the rural nature of Shropshire. But good news, I've got one good thing. If there's something called the Marches Energy Agency, and they will cancel people's energy debts this year. That's their winter scheme. If people have an energy debt, they can call up, MEA will pay it off. And also, the food banks are still there, they're not going anywhere, so they are there to support people, and Citizens Advice is going out into the food banks to try and get that to people. My question, not necessarily a question from Citizens Advice, but is, would debt justice ever happen if debt is still profitable? Can debt justice realistically happen whilst it's still profitable for someone?
It's a good question. Yeah, probably no. You're right, because yeah, with everyone who owes a debt, there's someone who's being owed to. With every debtor, there's a creditor somewhere. Having said that, we have seen debt being cancelled. I've given you 2 examples, of one example of Glasgow City Council cancelling debt, and just go back to my introduction when I was introducing John, Simon's brother there. John was was a really instrumental part of a global campaign to actually we managed to win $130 billion worth of debts wiped off for Global South debt, and that was a lot of that was owed to the IMF, World Bank, and also some of the private banks as well. So I think your question is really good, and I know what you're getting at, and I do agree with you on that on one level, but on the other hand, we have been able to win campaigns on this. But you're right, and ultimately we're fighting a system that's kind of against the things that we're fighting for, so it's always going to be tough. John, do you want to make a comment?
Well, I just wondered if something could be said about bankruptcy and the sort of lesser forms of bankruptcy there. I mean, I had relatives who got into terrible debt, and the thing that really helped them was going bankrupt. So they had to get rid of the house, but the debts were all reduced, and the bankruptcy people worked who was going to get what and so on, and then a line was drawn. Now, maybe they were in a privileged position because they had enough money to pay the bankruptcy fees, etc., etc. But that sort of thing, or its sort of smaller version, which you would know better than I, can be helpful to people. Could you say something about that? Either of you say something about that?
Do you want to go first and I can go second? Yeah.
Yes, so there's the DROs, which is a debt relief order, so someone can pay a fee and then it's, for a few years they don't, it's basically the slate's wiped cleaned, and then there's also bankruptcy. There's also something called an IVA, so an involuntary...
Individual voluntary agreements.
Individual voluntary agreement, and not involuntary. But we're seeing very aggressive IVA agreements because people have to pay a fee to create an IVA and they have to pay monthly fees. These IVAs are finding vulnerable people, offering them the solution, and they can't afford the IVA. So that's something that Citizens Advice is seeing. And then this is a personal comment, not from Citizens Advice Shropshire, but also something that's seen is a lot with people seeking advice on debt. Their best option is likely to go bankrupt, but they are going to organisations who have their own views because of religious leanings, and they would not suggest bankruptcy or DROs because they believe that you should pay your way. So I've met quite a few people who had that advice, and they're worse off, they would have been better off claiming bankruptcy, but they went to an organisation that told them that that wasn't right, that morally they should pay it off.
Yeah.
I find it strange that a religious organisation should argue that. I'm a religious person myself, but I can see that would be a problem.
Yeah, and I think, so John, just to let you know, there are bankruptcy, insolvency options out there, though they do, like I said, the bankruptcy has a sort of £680 fee, the DRO has a £90 fee, I think, and then the IVAs have fees given to the insolvency agents that enable you to have an individual voluntary agreement. So and then they also have a lot of stigma attached to them. There's also, even after your debts are cleared, after a year of DRO and a year of bankruptcy, that it still affects your credit rating. So things like getting a phone, for example, and even if you're not going to borrow money again, getting a phone will be really difficult, for example. So there are also, it's quite a punitive way of having debt relief. So our idea, for example, of energy debt write-off doesn't have the fees and the punitive kind of aspects to it. We also have a more radical idea, which we don't talk about so often just because we're not quite sure how to make this happen, but we have this other bigger radical idea, which is that we want to, we kind of came up with a model for it already a couple of years ago, and we got a debt expert to write the model for us, but essentially it would involve the government going into the secondary debt market and buying up lots of debts that have been written off. And then they could buy them because you can buy up written off debt for 10p for a pound of debt. And then instead of the secondary debt collectors buying up that debt, the government would buy up that debt, and then the government would then write off that debt on behalf of the people who owed it, and then using the debt advice system to provide a way to offer debt relief in a way that is doesn't have that level of stigma attached that bankruptcy and all those other options have, as well as the stigma attached to it and the punitive nature of what happens to your credit rating and your ability to hold directorships and all that kind of stuff that happens when you come out of these schemes. So that's why we talk about debt relief in the UK context a lot, because even though there are these free products, they're not always fit for purpose, and it's quite hard for people to access them because they're very expensive. And so we think there should be pots of money to provide debt relief for certain aspects of debt, and especially in the cost of living context right now, this feels like a really good time to talk about those sort of ideas. Yeah.
May I just mention debt as a deterrent for education, that young people will not apply for university if it means years of paying back the debt, or they will not look for a mortgage on a house, and it means more inferior means of housing for them and their future children. So that's another aspect of the debt problem, and what kind of future our country will have when you deprive young people. Yes.
Yeah, and you're right. I think that point also for me kind of reiterates the point around debt kind of exacerbating existing inequalities. So actually you do come from a lower income household, for example, actually you're deterred from going to university, actually that means that you might end up in that situation for a longer term, and not being able maybe to explore other routes or other career options or whatever because of the situation that debt could put in. But there's also the debt of student debt. So even like students who have who don't have families that can support them through university, they are borrowing throughout their time at university, and they have to pay all of that back when they come out as well. But it does cut to the heart of what the purpose of education is, and who can access it and who can't access it. So yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, based on my understanding of the thing about student debt, based on my understanding of the system, it almost seems like a farce, given that I've got tens of thousands of pounds worth of student debt. I've not paid any of it off because my income's below the threshold ever since I graduated. If my income's below the threshold for another, I think it's 15 years, I won't pay any of it off, it'll all be wiped. I'm probably going to pay off a minute proportion of it. So, that's a very, very odd system. Given that the vast majority of people will not pay off, will only pay off a very small proportion of it anyway.
So, no more questions. I think. Oh, sorry. Another question?
Oh no, sorry. Oh, she was just moving the camera. I thought she were
I've been absolutely fascinated by the talk today, and particularly by the questions and answers. And I came here, I don't quite know what I was expecting, but I wasn't expected to leave angry. And I am angry, because England is the second most unequal country in Europe. The worst, oddly enough, being Portugal. This is the difference between the rich and the poor. And the rich are getting richer, and the poor are getting poorer. And this is part of the system. And if you're not angry about it, you should be. So, on behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank Heidi for a really fascinating account. It really made us think. And thanks for coming all this way.